They say you never know what you would die for until the moment arrives with a gun in your face and a choice that allows no second chances. For Grace Monroe, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 1:47 in a restaurant that smelled of garlic and rosemary, with a child she barely knew trembling in her arms. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. Time stretched like taffy pulled too thin. Grace could see everything with the terrible clarity that comes before death: the worn wedding ring on the shooter's left hand, the coffee stain on his collar, the cold emptiness in his eyes that told her he had done this before and would do it again. Behind her, pressed against her ribs, a 6-year-old girl named Sophia whispered 3 words that would change the trajectory of 3 lives forever. "Don't leave me." Grace turned her back to the gun. The first bullet entered her left shoulder with a sound like a book slammed shut. The second punch thundered through her ribs with such force it knocked the breath from her lungs and sent stars dancing across her vision. She felt the child's small hands clutching her shirt, felt warm blood soaking through fabric, and skin felt the restaurant floor rising up to meet her as her knees buckled. The last thing Grace saw before darkness swallowed her whole was the little girl's face streaked with tears and terror, mouth open in a scream Grace could no longer hear. Then, nothing. Then, everything changed. 3 days earlier, this alarm clock never rang in Grace Monroe's apartment because Grace Monroe had stopped trusting alarm clocks years ago. Around the same time, she stopped trusting most things that promised reliability. Instead, she woke to the sound of her upstairs neighbor's television, bleeding through walls thin as promises, to the rattle of pipes that had needed replacing since before she moved in, to the particular quality of morning light that crept through windows she could not afford to replace. 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before she needed to be awake. 13 minutes she could have spent sleeping or remembering or trying not to remember. She sat up slowly, her brown hair falling across shoulders that carried more weight than any 29-year-old should have to bear. The studio apartment stretched out before her in the grey dawn, 300 square feet of everything she owned, everything she had managed to hold on to after the world took everything else. One wall was covered in photographs. She did not look at them often anymore. Looking hurt too much, and Grace had learned that some kinds of pain served no purpose except to remind you that you were still capable of bleeding. But this morning, her eyes found the largest photo as they always did. A boy with her same brown hair and her same stubborn chin, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that only 13-year-olds possess, that certainty that the world is vast and full of possibility and will never ever hurt you. Liam Monroe, 5 years gone, still 13 forever. Another day, Grace whispered to the photograph, to the ghost, to the empty apartment that held nothing but her and her grief and the rent she could barely afford. Not a prayer, not a wish, just the acknowledgement that she was still here, still breathing, still moving forward, because stopping had never been an option. She dressed with the efficiency of someone who had long ago abandoned the luxury of choice. Black slacks worn thin at the knees, white button-down shirt with a small stain near the hem that would be hidden by her apron. Black sneakers with soles worn smooth from too many miles, walked for too little pay. The mirror showed her a woman who looked older than 29, lines around her eyes, worry in every detail. But her eyes still held something that 5 years of grief had not managed to extinguish. Kindness, perhaps, maybe even warmth. By 6:15, she was on the subway. By 7:23, she was walking the 3 blocks to Romano's Italian kitchen, pulling her thin coat tighter against the November wind that cut through the streets of Little Italy like a knife through butter. She had meant to buy a warmer one last year, but dreams and winter coats had to wait when rent came first. The restaurant smelled like home. Not her home, which smelled like old pipes and disappointment, but the kind of home she had always imagined existing somewhere for someone. Garlic sautéing in olive oil, fresh bread pulling from the oven, basil and oregano, and the rich complex scent of tomato sauce that had been simmering since before dawn. "Morning, Gracie," called Tony Romano, from where he swept the sidewalk with more energy than any 63-year-old man had a right to possess. His face creased into a smile that reached his eyes, the kind of smile that reminded Grace there was still goodness in the world if you knew where to look. "Morning, Tony," she replied, offering a tired but real smile. Inside Maria, Romano stood at the stove, wooden spoon in hand, grey hair pinned back in a bun that had probably looked the same for 40 years. She turned when Grace entered and without a word held out a spoonful of sauce. "Taste this," Maria said in her warm Italian accent. Grace tasted. The flavors bloomed across her tongue: sweet tomatoes, sharp garlic, the faintest hint of red wine, and something else, something she could not quite identify. "Fennel," Maria said, watching Grace's face with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond. "Just a whisper. You taste it." Grace nodded. For 2 hours every morning before the restaurant opened, she stood in this kitchen learning the language Maria spoke most fluently. Not Italian, though Maria spoke that too, not English, but the language of food, of love, translated through ingredients and heat and the kind of patience that comes from knowing some things cannot be rushed. Once Grace had dreamed of culinary school, of becoming a chef, of opening her own restaurant where she would create dishes that made people close their eyes and remember what it felt like to be home. That was before medical bills, before Liam, before reality taught her that some dreams were meant for other people, for people whose lives did not fall apart when they were 24 and still trying to figure out who they were supposed to become. But she had this: 2 hours, 3 mornings a week, learning from a woman who treated her like the daughter she never had. It was not the dream, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than nothing. "The lunch rush will be heavy today," Maria said, moving to the cutting board where vegetables waited to be transformed. "Tuesday. People need comfort food on Tuesdays." Grace smiled. Maria had a theory about every day of the week and what people needed to survive it. By 11:15, the kitchen was ready. By 11:30, the first customers had trickled in. By 11:45, Grace had served coffee to the regulars, had smiled at the tourists, had moved through the restaurant with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to do it in her sleep. That was when the bell above the door chimed. Grace looked up from wiping down the counter, and time did something strange. It did not stop exactly, but it slowed the way it does when your brain recognizes that something important is about to happen and wants to make sure you are paying attention. The woman who entered moved like water, like smoke, like something that existed between solid and shadow. Tall, angular, with the kind of posture that spoke of military training or years of vigilance or both. Her eyes swept the restaurant with the precision of someone conducting reconnaissance, cataloging exits and threats and the exact distance between tables. But it was not the woman who made Grace's breath catch. It was the child. She could not have been older than 6, small for her age, with dark curls that framed a face that should have been bright with childhood, but instead carried a sadness so profound it seemed to age her features. She wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent, a pale pink scarf wrapped around her neck and clutched to her chest, a stuffed rabbit that had clearly been loved nearly to death. The girl's eyes met Grace's across the restaurant, and in that instant, Grace saw something that made her heart squeeze painfully in her chest. She saw Liam, not physically. The girl looked nothing like her brother, but in her eyes, Grace recognized the particular quality of sorrow that came from losing something precious, from being too young to understand why the world was cruel, but old enough to know that it was. The woman led the child to a table by the window. The girl climbed onto the chair with careful precision, placed her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hops, though Grace did not yet know his name, on the table, like a companion at a tea party, and folded her hands in her lap with the kind of perfect posture that spoke of strict instruction. Grace approached with her notepad and pen, pushing down the strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with old grief and everything to do with the recognition of new pain in someone else. "Hello, sweetheart," Gracie said softly, crouching down, so she was at eye level with the child. "What would you like to order?" The girl glanced at the woman, seeking permission. The woman gave the smallest nod. Spaghetti. The child said, her voice clear as wind chimes and just as fragile. But only with butter, no tomato sauce, no cheese, and water with no ice. Grace smiled the kind of smile that reached her eyes and meant it. A wonderful choice. Will you and your rabbit be having the same thing? For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corners of the girl's mouth. She hugged Mr. Hobbs tighter and nodded. As Grace walked back toward the kitchen, she felt the woman's eyes following her. Not suspicious exactly, but assessing, watching. The kind of watchfulness that suggested she had been trained to see threats in every shadow and had never quite managed to turn that training off. In the kitchen, Maria was kneading bread dough, her strong hands working the flour and water into submission. New customers? Maria asked, not looking up. A little girl, Grace murmured, reaching for a clean pot. With sadness, older than her age, Maria's hands stilled. She glanced through the kitchen window to where the woman and child sat in profile against the grey November light. And the woman with her, not a mother, Grace said quietly, but someone who would die to protect her. Maria nodded and returned to her bread. In the Romano kitchen, some truths did not need explanation. Grace prepared the dish with more care than usual, testing the butter to make sure it was melted to exactly the right consistency, arranging the pasta on the plate with an attention to detail that Maria noticed and said nothing about. When she placed the plate before the child, the girl looked up with those two old eyes and whispered, "Thank you." She set Mr. Hobbs beside the plate with careful reverence and began to eat slowly, precisely, as though she had been taught that every action must be performed perfectly, even when no one was watching to judge. Thalia moved away to give them privacy, but she found herself glancing back every few minutes, drawn by something she could not name. After a while, she noticed the girl had pulled a pencil from somewhere and was drawing on a paper napkin with intense concentration. Grace moved closer, curiosity overcoming professional distance. "What are you drawing?" she asked gently. The girl looked up, those ancient eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Grace's breath catch. "My castle," the child said softly. "But it only exists in my head." Grace tilted her head, studying the drawing. It showed a castle with pointed towers and a sky full of stars rendered in simple pencil strokes. But there was something wrong with it, something that made Grace's chest tighten. The castle had no windows, no doors, just solid walls and towers reaching toward an empty sky. "Why only in your head?" Grace asked, keeping her voice gentle. The girl's small hand stilled on the napkin. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet, Grace had to lean closer to hear. "Because my house is not like a castle. It just has a lot of silence." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through something deep in Grace's chest. She understood silence. She understood living in a place that once held laughter and now held only the echo of what had been lost. She sat down across from the girl, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be working, that there were other customers, that this child was a stranger. "Silence can be loud sometimes," Grace said softly, "louder than any noise." The girl nodded, a single sharp movement that conveyed more understanding than any 6-year-old should possess. Before Grace could say anything else, the woman, Elena, though Grace did not yet know her name, stood with a movement so fluid it seemed to have no beginning. She placed a hand on the child's shoulder, gentle but firm. "We have to go," Elena said. Her voice was low, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. The girl nodded and slipped from her chair, tucking her drawing into her pocket and gathering Mr. Hobbs into her arms. Before she left, she turned back to Grace and whispered, "You make the best pasta I have ever eaten." Then she was gone, vanishing through the door with the woman at her side, leaving behind only an empty plate and a lingering emptiness that Grace could not explain. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, feeling something crack and tighten in her chest simultaneously. She could not explain why, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would see the girl again. And next time, it would not be peaceful. The afternoon crawled forward with the relentless pace of all Tuesday afternoons. The lunch rush swelled and receded like a tide. Tourists came and went. Regulars settled into their usual tables with their usual orders. The kitchen produced plate after plate of comfort food for people who needed Tuesdays to be survivable. But Grace could not stop thinking about the girl with the two old eyes and the castle that existed nowhere except in her imagination. When she returned to clean the table where they had sat, Grace looked carefully at the napkin the girl had left behind. The castle drawing stared back at her, all those towers reaching toward a sky full of carefully drawn stars, all those walls with no way in or out. But in the very center where windows or warm yellow lights should have been, there was only a dark, heavily shaded void, a castle without light. Grace folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket, unsure why but feeling the need to keep it. Her eyes moved to the corner where the two had sat. When Sophia spoke to her, Elena had always positioned herself at an angle, eyes never leaving the door. Even while the girl ate or drew, Elena remained alert, her eyes constantly scanning her posture, suggesting readiness for violence at any moment. This was not a nanny, not an aunt, not family at all in the traditional sense. This was a bodyguard, or something close to it. Someone who had lived too long in a state of vigilance, who moved like a weapon waiting to be needed. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light flakes that tapped against the window like the quiet rhythm of something approaching. Tony stepped in from the storage room, a bundle of fresh oregano in his weathered hands. He paused, studying Grace's face with the kind of attention that came from decades of reading people. "That kid," he said quietly. Her eyes looked like she has seen things she should not have seen. Grace nodded slowly, fingering the napkin in her pocket. "And the woman with her," Tony continued, setting the herbs on the counter. "Did you notice how she kept watching the exits?" "I noticed. The way she stood, the way she scanned the room, the way she sat with her back to the wall." Tony's voice dropped even lower. "That is someone who has lived in dangerous places." A chill ran down Grace's spine, partly because of what she had witnessed, partly because her instincts, sharpened by poverty and loss over nearly a decade, were reacting. When danger was near, it did not speak to the mind first. It spoke to intuition, and her intuition was screaming that those two were not simply customers passing through. Later that afternoon during her break, Grace sat in the small room behind the kitchen and pulled out the napkin again. She smoothed it flat on the rickety table, her fingers tracing the faint pencil marks. This castle had no people, no light, no open windows or welcoming doors. It resembled a fortress more than a home, a place designed to keep the world out rather than to let anyone in. And again, she heard the child's soft voice echoing in her mind so clearly. It was as though she sat beside Grace in the cramped break room. "My house is not like a castle. It just has a lot of silence." Grace pressed her palm flat against the drawing and closed her eyes. She did not know why, but she was certain the girl's story held more than anyone could see from the outside. Somehow she sensed she would be drawn into it sooner than she imagined. By the time her shift ended, the snow was falling steadily, blanketing the streets in white that would turn to grey slush by morning. Grace walked to the subway, with her thin coat pulled tight and her hands shoved deep in her pockets, one hand wrapped around the folded napkin like a talisman. Back in her apartment, she made tea she could barely afford and stood at the window watching snow fall past the streetlights that turned the night orange and surreal. The photograph of Liam watched from the wall, frozen forever at 13 forever, smiling forever gone. "I met someone today," Grace said to the photograph, to the memory, to the empty room. "A little girl. She reminded me of you. Not the way you looked, but the way you looked at me that last day when you knew something was wrong but did not know how to say it." The apartment offered no response. It never did. Grace went to bed early, but sleep came late and brought dreams of castles without doors, and children with ancient eyes and the sound of silence that was louder than any scream. She did not know that in exactly 18 hours and 23 minutes, the little girl would walk back through the doors of Romano's Italian kitchen. She did not know that 3 men with guns and empty eyes would follow. She did not know that she would make a choice that would alter the course of 3 lives and drag her into a world she never imagined existed. But somewhere deep in her bones, in that place where instinct lives and truth resonates, she knew that everything was about to change. The lunch rush at Romano's had reached its fever pitch, every table occupied, the kitchen producing plates with assembly line efficiency, the air thick with conversation, and the clatter of silverware and the rich smells of garlic and wine and fresh bread. Grace carried a tray of food toward table 7. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up by reflex, and time did that thing again. That's slowing. That particular quality of attention that the universe demands when something significant is about to unfold. The child stood in the doorway. Sophia, though Grace did not yet know her name. The same cream coat, the same pink scarf, the same Mr. Hobbs clutched to her chest. But her eyes were different today. Yesterday they had held sorrow. Today they held something sharper. Fear. Elena stood beside her with one hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder, but her other hand had moved to her bag, fingers brushing the zipper with the unconscious readiness of someone who knew exactly what lived inside. Grace set down the tray at table 7, her hands suddenly unsteady, and moved toward them without quite knowing why. "Hello again, sweetheart," she said, crouching to the child's level. "Would you like the same table?" But even as she spoke, Grace's eyes were scanning the restaurant with an instinct she had not known she possessed, looking for whatever had put that expression on Elena's face, that tension in her shoulders. That was when she saw them. 3 men. They entered separately, spaced 10 seconds apart, but moving with the synchronized precision of a unit that had rehearsed their movements. They did not look like tourists. They did not look like businessmen grabbing lunch. They did not look like anyone who had come to Romano's to enjoy Maria's cooking. They looked like men who had come to end something. The first man positioned himself by the door. The second moved toward the back exit. The third walked slowly between tables, his hand tucked inside his jacket, in a way that made Grace's blood turn to ice. Elena saw them at the exact same moment. Her hand moved into her bag with practiced speed, and when it emerged, it held something small and dark and unmistakably deadly. The restaurant seemed to take a collective breath. Then the third man's hand came out of his jacket holding a gun, and that breath turned into screams. Everything happened at once and in slow motion simultaneously. Customers dove under tables. Chairs crashed to the floor. Glass shattered. Tony shouted something Grace could not hear over the sudden roar of blood in her ears. But Grace did not move towards safety. Her eyes had locked onto the girl who stood frozen in the center of the chaos, hops falling from nerveless fingers, her mouth opened in a silent scream. And the third man was turning toward her gun, rising finger moving toward the trigger with terrible inevitability. Grace did not think. Thinking would have meant hesitation. Hesitation would have meant death, not hers, the child's. And Grace Monroe, who had spent 5 years living with the memory of her brother bleeding out on a sidewalk while strangers ran past without stopping, who had spent 5 years asking herself why no one had done something, anything to save a 13-year-old boy who had his whole life ahead of him, made a choice that allowed no going back. She ran. Her body moved with a speed she did not know she possessed, fueled by terror and memory, and something deeper than conscious thought. She reached the child in 3 strides, dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around the small trembling body, and turned her back to the gun. Time crystallized into perfect clarity. She felt the child's heartbeat against her chest, rapid and terrified and alive. She heard Elena screaming something, firing her own weapon with controlled precision. She heard more glass breaking, more screaming, the sound of wood splintering as bullets found walls instead of flesh. And then she felt it. The first bullet punched through her left shoulder with a force that seemed impossible, like being hit by a sledgehammer wrapped in fire. The pain was instant and absolute, radiating through her entire body in waves that made her vision blur. But she held the child tighter. The second bullet slammed into her ribs just below her right breast, and this time the pain was so intense it stole every thought except one: don't let go. She felt warm blood soaking through her shirt, felt it spreading across the child's hands and coat, felt the strength leaving her body like water draining from a broken vessel. The girl was crying, her voice breaking, repeating the same words over and over. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Grace, you are hurt. Do not leave me." Grace tried to speak, tried to say it would be all right. Tried to promise she would not leave, but her lungs would not cooperate. Blood filled her mouth with a taste like copper and rust and finality. Through the haze of pain, she heard more gunshots, heard bodies hitting the floor, heard Elena's voice cold and controlled. "Do not fall asleep, Grace. You saved her. You have to stay." She felt the child being pulled from her arms, felt strong hands lowering her to the floor with surprising gentleness, felt something being pressed against her wounds. The restaurant around her had dissolved into chaos. People crying, Tony's voice shouting, Maria's voice praying in rapid Italian, the sound of sirens approaching from somewhere far away. But the only thing anchoring Grace to consciousness was the small hand that found hers and gripped it with desperate strength. The child's hand, still there, still holding on. "Please don't go," the girl sobbed, her face appearing in Grace's fading vision. "Please, please don't go." Grace tried to open her eyes wider, tried to see the child's face one more time, tried to memorize it so that if this was the end, she would at least know that she had done one thing right. The child's eyes were the last thing she saw before darkness swept over her in a wave too powerful to resist. Wide and terrified and pleading, old eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen too much and were now seeing more. Eyes that would haunt Grace Monroe for the rest of her life, however long or short that life turned out to be. The darkness came, and somewhere in that darkness, Grace understood with perfect clarity that she had just crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Her life, whatever remained of it, would never be the same. Aftermath, blood streaked across the worn tile floor of Romano's dark and thick, as though refusing to part from Grace's body. She lay motionless, her head tilted to one side. Brown hair matted against the wound, soaking through her shoulder. Sophia, for that was the child's name, though Grace did not yet know it, knelt beside her. The child's small hand pressed desperately against Grace's chest, as if she could hold the woman's heartbeat in place. "Please do not die." Sophia's voice cracked hoarse from crying. She shook Grace's shoulder, but the bodies only stirred faintly before going limp again. Tears streamed down Sophia's cheeks, falling onto the blood below. Elena crouched beside them, one hand gripping a phone tied to her ear, her gaze never leaving the pair on the floor. Her voice was low and precise, carrying command. "Call the private doctor. Mobilize the private ambulance. Location, Romano's Little Italy. Emergency level critical. Child present." A moment later, she pulled a second phone from her coat, a small black device with no logo and only one button. She pressed and waited. After 3 rings, a man's deep, cold voice answered. "Speak." Elena did not hesitate. "A woman." She shielded Sophia. "She took 2 bullets. She is unconscious. I am keeping her alive until your team arrives." Silence fell on the other end. Then the man's voice returned, altered, weighted with something harsher than his usual detachment. "Her name, Grace Monroe." Silence again, heavier, and then only a single command: "Keep her alive at any cost." Elena ended the call and knelt fully beside Grace. Sophia was still sobbing, her face blotched red, her small hands sticky with blood. Elena pressed her coat against the wound along Grace's ribs and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. She reached into her pocket for a specialized hemostatic bandage, reserved only for the gravest emergencies, and secured it over the wound in Grace's shoulder. Blood soaked through the fabric and onto Elena's hands, hot and metallic, but she did not blink or tremble. She knew she was holding life itself for the woman who had thrown her own body over the child who mattered more than anything in their world. In the distance, sirens sounded, but not the screeching wail of public ambulances. This was a low-control engine, fast and quiet. A black SUV slipped behind Romano's, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out with a medical case built for emergency field surgery. They did not need to ask questions. Elena spoke only 2 words. Grace Monroe. One man knelt, checked the pulse, then nodded to the second. There is a chance. They lifted Grace onto the stretcher with surprising gentleness. Sophia clung to Grace's hand, screaming, "I'm going with her. She cannot go without me." Elena nodded. "Go. No one will take you from her." The child was carried into the vehicle, still clutching Mr. Hobbs, her hands smeared with Grace's blood. As the SUV sped through the back streets, Elena stood alone in the wreckage. Romano's was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Customers had been evacuated. Maria sat stunned on the kitchen floor while Tony Romano stood shaking, wiping Grace's blood from the tiles with a napkin. Elena lifted her eyes toward the grey afternoon sky, the wind cutting sharply against her collar. She knew she had called a man who hated to be disturbed, but today was different. Today, a stranger had taken bullets for Sofia Moretti, a woman with no connection to their violent world. And that could change everything. Days bled into nights in a haze of antiseptic and hushed voices when Grace finally surfaced from the darkness. The pain was not sharp, but a dull, heavy anchor dragging her down. The first light she sensed was not sunlight, but the soft glow of recessed lamps diffused through milk-white curtains. The air smelled of antiseptic and clean linen. She tried to move, but her body felt anchored beneath layers of blankets and dull throbbing pain. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting a ceiling carved with intricate molding. Nothing like any public hospital she had ever seen. The room was unnaturally quiet. No footsteps, no alarms, only the hush of her own heartbeat. She turned her head, a small movement that drew a groan from her throat. The door opened. A man stepped inside, tall and composed in a grey suit, with a black coat draped over his arm. His hair was neatly trimmed, but it was his eyes that struck her sharp as blades, yet carrying a worn exhaustion. He stood still for a moment before speaking softly. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Grace blinked, her mind struggling to settle. "Your daughter." He nodded, his voice deep and steady. "Sophia is the child you shielded. I am Nathaniel Moretti. I believe Elena told you a little." Grace tried to sit up, but pain shot through her shoulder, forcing her to tense. He stepped closer, not touching her, but bracing his hand on the bed rail, ready to steady her if needed. "You should rest. You lost a significant amount of blood." Grace looked around the large room with its walnut furniture, white silk drapes, and a vase of orchids glowing beside a window that overlooked a lush garden. This was no ordinary hospital. She swallowed. "Where am I?" "Nathaniel." Nate answered without hesitation. "My family's private medical facility just outside Manhattan. We wanted to ensure you receive the best care." Grace exhaled slowly, closing her eyes briefly to calm her pulse. "I do not have insurance." His head tilted, a faint smile appearing, not quite warm but not unkind. "That is not a concern. Everything is taken care of, and I am not here to negotiate gratitude. I am here to make a proposal." Grace opened her eyes and looked at the stranger whose life had collided with hers through blood and gunfire. "What kind of proposal?" Nate lowered himself into a chair beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Sophia is in shock. She has not spoken since the attack, but she keeps asking for you. She feels safe with you." He paused, choosing his words with precision. "I want to invite you to stay at my home while you recover, not as a guest. As someone who can be near Sophia, you would have private medical support staff your own room, and I will ensure you lack nothing." Grace stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to live with your family just because Sophia wants it?" Nate held her gaze without blinking. "No, I want Sophia to have someone she trusts, someone who can help her heal. I cannot give her that, but you can. You threw yourself over her without a moment's hesitation. That means more to me than any oath of loyalty." Grace did not know how to respond. Pain, confusion, and something else. A quiet, trembling emotion rose within her. She was not someone who trusted easily, not someone accustomed to kindness without a price. But Sophia's eyes, the child's choked scream as she bled in Grace's arms, still echoed inside her. Grace nodded faintly, as though she herself could hardly believe it. I need a few days to recover and to understand what is happening, but if it helps the child, I will come. Nate nodded, his expression softening just slightly. Thank you, Grace Monroe. He rose and stepped out of the room, leaving her alone with the slowing rhythm of her own heartbeat. And in that quiet, she understood one truth with chilling clarity. This was not merely kindness from a father. This was the beginning of something larger, more complicated, and far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. 5 days later. The black SUV rolled silently along a gravel path, leading toward the Moretti estate just as the sun dipped behind the pines. Grace sat in the back seat clutching a small bag containing only a few clean clothes, an old notebook, and the napkin with Sophia's castle drawing. She still was not entirely certain of her decision. From a cramped 300 square foot room in Queens to an estate guarded by men in black, scattered like chess pieces, she felt as if she had stepped into a story that was never meant for someone like her. But deep in her chest, she knew she had come because of Sophia's eyes, because of the child's sobbing voice when blood soaked through Grace's shirt, because of a bond she could not explain. The vehicle stopped before a small house set apart from the main mansion, a red brick cottage with a sloping roof and pale purple bougainvillea spilling over the porch. The door opened, releasing a warm amber light onto the stone path. Elena waited outside, her expression composed as always, yet softened by something almost imperceptible. She nodded for Grace to enter. This is the guest house. You will stay here close to the main home but with privacy. There is a private doctor staff and security. If you want quiet, you will have quiet. Grace stepped inside, her palms damp. The interior was elegant but warm, not ostentatious. A cushioned armchair sat beside a large window. A stone fireplace glowed softly, and the bookshelves held fairy tales and cookbooks. In the corner stood an old piano with ivory keys faded by time. Grace exhaled quietly, allowing herself to believe this place was real. She had barely set her bag down when small footsteps pattered up the porch. The door swung open and Sophia rushed in like a burst of wind, throwing her arms around Grace with a force that startled her. "Grace, you really came." The girl looked up, her brown eyes shimmering with tears and joy. She still carried Mr. Hobbs' one frayed ear dangling. Grace bent down, hugging her tightly, despite the lingering ache in her shoulder, her heart softening in ways she had not thought possible. Sophia pulled back, reaching behind her for a folded paper. She unfolded it carefully and held it out with both hands. "I drew this yesterday. It is for you." The picture showed two figures standing together in a field of purple flowers, one tall with brown hair, the other small, holding Mr. Hobbs. Above them, in uneven but earnest letters, were the words, "Grace and Sophia, best friends forever." Grace's heart clenched, not from physical pain, but from something fragile and beautiful she had believed she no longer deserved. She sat in the armchair and lifted Sophia onto her lap, her hand brushing gently through the child's soft hair. "You draw beautifully. I will keep this forever." Sophia nodded and rested her head on Grace's shoulder, her small body melting into her. In that moment, within the warm glow of the unfamiliar house, Grace no longer thought of bullets or blood or the shadows of her past. She only knew she was needed. Not as a server, not as a survivor, struggling through each day, but as something greater, someone to trust, a place to return to. And for Sophia, perhaps she had just become the first true home the child had ever known. 2 weeks later, Grace woke just as a pale thread of sunlight slipped through the thick oak canopy. It had been 2 weeks since the shooting, yet sitting up in bed, it still required a calculated effort against the sharp protest of her healing ribs. She moved slowly, her left arm immobilized in a sling, her breath shallow to avoid pulling at the stitches. The doctor had ordered bed rest, but Grace had never been good at staying still. She managed to brew tea with one hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and shuffled onto the porch, her eyes drifting toward the main estate. The house was not merely large, it was fortified with a vigilance that reminded her of a modern-day citadel. Guards in black suits patrolled in rotating pairs. Cameras sat mounted on every corner, and behind the Rose Conservatory stood a small watchtower. The iron gate was tall and deceptively heavy, manned consistently by two guards who inspected every vehicle coming and going. Every movement followed protocol. Every person knew their role and no one deviated from the silent underlying command structure. Grace had heard whispers about the Moretti reputation, but witnessing such an extensive security system unnerved her in a way she had not expected. It was not only wealth on display, it was preparedness, bordering on paranoia, a sign of lives lived with danger never more than a step away. And she was now in the very center of it. Yet behind all those layers of steel and silence was Sophia. Sophia remained a 6-year-old child with unfiltered curiosity, endless questions, and a heart more attached to Grace than she had anticipated. In a matter of days, the two of them had settled into their own rhythm, reading together on the window seat in the afternoons, making pancakes on quiet Sunday mornings, covering the kitchen in flour and laughter, then curling beneath blankets at night, as Grace read fairy tales into the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Sophia did not laugh often, but when she did, it felt like the sun breaking through a world made entirely of shadows. One afternoon, as they colored together in the cottage living room, Sophia spoke suddenly without looking up, her voice thin as though speaking of something not entirely her own. "Grace, my mother died in a car accident." Grace paused her coloring and looked at the child filling in the roof of a castle with a red crayon. "Do you miss her?" Sophia nodded, her lips pressed tight. "I miss the smell of her hair." She smiled a lot, but she also looked far away sometimes, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Grace rested her hand gently on the girl's. "Does your father talk about her?" The question brought a long silence. Sophia set her crayon down, leaned back in her chair, and her eyes dimmed as though a door had been slammed by the wind. "He only says the car lost control, that no one did anything wrong. It was just unlucky." In the child's eyes, Grace recognized a quiet doubt. The kind children sense but cannot articulate, the shape of truths left untold. She wrapped her arms around Sophia, her embrace soft and protective, as if sheltering her from the emptiness her words had revealed. Later that night, as Grace wrote in her journal, beside the window, she glanced toward the main house where the lights glowed against the glass panes like watchful eyes. Something was wrong. A simple car accident did not explain the fortress-like security, nor the haunted look in Sophia's story, nor the cold, impenetrable silence Nathaniel Moretti carried like a second skin. Every step Grace took inside this estate felt like another step into a labyrinth woven with secrets. But deep inside, she had already made her choice. For Sophia, for the way the child looked at her as if she were a rare place of safety, fortress or not, mystery or not, she would not leave while the girl still needed her. The discovery. That late afternoon, while Sophia studied with her tutor in the mansion library, Grace used the quiet to investigate the old cabinet in the corner of the guest house. She spotted a box on the top shelf. Reaching up was impossible. Her shoulders screamed in protest at the mere thought. She dragged a heavy chair over, gritting her teeth against the sharp flare of pain in her ribs with every step. Standing on her toes, she didn't try to lift it. Instead, she used her good hand to slowly inch the heavy wooden box toward the edge. It teetered dangerously. Grace held her breath, bracing herself, and let it tip, catching it against her uninjured side. The sudden weight nearly knocked her over, forcing a choked cry from her lips as the impact rattled her healing bones. She sank to the floor, trembling and breathless, clutching the box like a lifeline before the black spots in her vision could take over. Grace sat down heavily, waiting for the black spots in her vision to clear before she opened the box. One box held a stack of old photo albums, their leather covers frayed at the corners. She sat down and began turning the pages, slowly uncovering fragments of a life once lived on this very estate. There were family pictures in the garden, photos of a much younger Sophia nestled in the arms of a woman with long dark hair and a gentle smile. Grace did not need to ask to know this was Isabel, Sophia's mother. She turned the pages and watched time unfold in snapshots of birthdays, picnics, and quiet domestic moments. Isabel appeared in nearly every frame, always at the center a woman of softness and an unexplained sadness lingering behind her eyes. Then Grace stopped. In the middle of the album was a photograph of Isabel standing before a silver blue convertible, her hair caught in the wind as she laughed up at whoever held the camera. But it was not the car or the expression that trapped Grace's gaze. It was the necklace, a thin chain of white gold holding a precisely cut amethyst pendant shaped into a six-pointed star. Grace froze. She had seen that necklace before, without question. It was the same necklace worn by the only eyewitness to the shooting that killed Liam, her younger brother. Grace remembered it with painful clarity because she had stared at the grainy CCTV still the police released when appealing for witnesses. Among the fleeing crowd, one woman had glanced back, her pendant catching the streetlight like a solitary star in the dark, and then she vanished. No name, no statement, no court appearance. The case collapsed for lack of evidence, and Liam's death dissolved into the forgotten tragedies of children caught in battles they never belonged to. Grace touched the photograph with trembling fingers, her heartbeat pounding. It could not be coincidence. Isabel Moretti, the woman said to have died in a car crash, might have been present the night Liam was murdered, might have seen everything, might know the truth. Grace leaned back in her chair, emotions surging in a chaos she could not contain. Anger, confusion, fear, and a fierce rising need to pull at every thread. If Isabel truly was the woman she remembered, why was she there? Why had she disappeared? And why had her name, her necklace returned to Grace's life, precisely now when she had nearly surrendered her search for answers? She closed her eyes, seeing Liam at 13, his shy smile, his uneven birthday cake their mother had made with all her love. When she opened her eyes, she closed the album and held it against her chest as though it were a missing piece of a long broken puzzle. Perhaps fate had not placed her beside Sophia out of kindness alone. Perhaps she was drawn into this place for a reason far larger, tethered by an invisible line stretched from the blood on a Bronx sidewalk to the very doors of this mansion. And she knew from that moment that she could no longer pretend. She had to know the truth, even if the truth destroyed everything. The search Grace did not sleep that night. After tucking Sophia into bed and finishing the familiar bedtime story, she returned to the cottage living room, closed the curtains tightly, and opened the worn laptop she had carried from her tiny Queens apartment. She typed Isabel Moretti into the search bar, but the results were vague, dominated by gossip magazines, society features, and photographs from charity events with Nate. Nothing mentioned the car crash in detail. No official reports, no public death record. Only a brief 3-year-old notice stating that Isabel Moretti died in a rainy night highway accident, with no survivors, no scene photos, no police confirmation, nothing verifiable. A cold ripple moved through Grace's spine. She refined her search, forcing herself to recall every detail of the CCTV image from Liam's case. The woman had been labeled a key witness, but was never found. She typed Bronx shooting 2019 missing witness. The first result was an old local broadcast naming the woman as Isabel Vega, age 30, the primary witness in a case tied to the Castellanos cartel, one of the most dangerous drug families in New York at the time. According to the report, she had agreed to testify after being arrested in a federal raid, entering witness protection in exchange for cooperation. But only weeks later, she vanished from the system. No records, no sightings, nothing. She disappeared as though she had never existed. Grace stared at the name Isabel Vega, then back at the photo of Isabel Moretti in the album. It was impossible to ignore the connection. The pieces began aligning with unnerving precision. If Isabel had once been Isabel Vega, if she had lived under witness protection, then what did her marriage to Nate Moretti mean? A coincidence or a calculated move? And if so, was her supposed accident truly an accident, or the final silencing of someone who knew too much? Grace's pulse quickened. She searched public databases, dug through old court archives, but nearly everything linked to the case had been sealed or erased. All she uncovered was a skeletal FBI entry noting Isabel Vega as missing, presumed endangered by the Castellanos organization, with the case unresolved. She leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning through fragments. She thought of Sofia, of Nate, of the cold shadow in Elena's eyes. They might all know. Perhaps only Grace did not. Or worse, perhaps only Grace wanted to. The instinct of someone who has lost a loved one never truly quiets. And now it whispered fiercely at her ear. Isabel Moretti did not die in a car accident. Isabel Moretti had once been Isabel Vega, and that past had not faded into oblivion. Grace closed the laptop, her heart still trembling. In the thick hush of the midnight hours, she understood she had stepped deeper into a dangerous maze. But she also understood something else with startling clarity. If there was any road left that could lead her to the truth about Liam, about the woman in that blurred photograph, about the moment her life had snapped in two, then that road began here inside this fortress named Moretti. And she would not turn back. Not when the answers were finally within reach. The warning. The next morning, as Grace was washing glasses in the little cottage kitchen, the door opened without warning. Marco stood at the threshold, a polite smile on his lips, though nothing in his eyes resembled friendliness. He wore a black shirt, hands tucked casually into his pockets, carrying himself as if he had stepped through this doorway 100 times before. Grace turned her pulse, catching for a moment. Marco was the head of security for the estate, a man who spoke little but seemed always to appear exactly where he intended, his gaze sharp as a blade. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said, his voice warm in tone but calculated in every syllable. "I only want to make sure you are comfortable here, but Moretti values the safety of his family above all else." Grace set the last glass onto the drying rack, wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, and kept her voice calm. "Thank you. I'm getting used to everything." Marco stepped further inside, his gaze sweeping the room quickly as though assessing not only the space, but her. "You are careful. I like that. But sometimes being too curious is not good for one's health, especially in a place like this. The wrong questions can lead to unnecessary trouble." Grace felt her heartbeat tighten. She said nothing, meeting his stare steadily. Marco allowed a faint, indifferent smile, lifted a framed drawing from the table, and examined it quietly. It was Sofia's picture with the words, "Grace and Sofia, best friends forever." He studied it a moment longer than necessary, then set it back precisely where he found it. "Sofia is very fond of you. Mr. Moretti as well. That is why I came, only to remind you that peace here is maintained by order. Everyone has a role, and if someone steps outside that role, everything becomes unbalanced." Without waiting for a response, Marco turned and walked out, leaving Grace standing in silence, her mind tangled in the kind of warning that was vague enough to avoid accusation but unmistakable in its intent. Later that afternoon, Elena stopped by to check Grace's bandages. Her appearance was as composed as ever. But when she sat across from Grace in the living room, her eyes no longer carried their usual neutrality. "Marco was here?" she asked bluntly. Grace nodded and repeated the conversation. Elena listened, her brows tightening, before she fell quiet for a long moment. "Do not look into anything else, Grace," she said at last, her voice soft but absolute. "No one here likes being watched. And Marco is not only the head of security, he is the person Nate trusts when something needs doing that the law cannot handle." Grace wanted to ask more, but she could not. She simply nodded. That evening, while walking with Sofia through the garden behind the cottage, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A faint rustle in the shrubs, the glimpse of a black sleeve disappearing behind a mossy wall. When she turned, there was no one. The quiet settled around them as though nothing had happened, but the back of her neck prickled. For the first time since arriving, the cottage no longer felt entirely safe. The walls, the cameras, the guards, none of it existed solely to protect someone from the outside world. It was also a system of vigilance, of control, of watching every breath within its boundaries. And now she had stepped too close to the center of the storm. She began to understand that if Isabel truly had been silenced, then that truth was not simply hidden. It was being guarded behind layers of danger. And the next person at risk might be her. Sophia's secret. 2 days after Marco's quiet warning, the air around the cottage felt inexplicably heavier. Grace sensed eyes on her. Wherever she walked, sensed that even her smallest gestures were being observed through a lens she could not see. Yet that feeling only sharpened her need to understand, to tear away whatever veil the estate had wrapped around the lives of Sophia and Nate. One afternoon, when the amber light of late day streamed through the stained glass window, scattering colors like a chapel mosaic across the garden, she sat with Sophia as the child arranged lavender sprigs into a glass jar made from an old jam container. It appeared peaceful, yet a weight hovered beneath the stillness. Grace brushed Sophia's hair gently and asked in the softest tone, "My sweetheart, do you miss your mother?" Sophia lifted her eyes, quiet but far older than 7. "Yes, I dream of her every night, but she always stands far away, like she does not want me to come closer." Grace swallowed, her throat tightening. "Does your father ever tell you more about her? About what happened?" Sophia twisted the hem of her shirt, hesitated, then whispered, as though afraid someone might hear. "I once heard Dad fighting with Uncle Marco. I was hiding under the stairs that night. Dad was so angry. He said, 'They found her.'" Grace's heart lurched. "They, who are they?" Sophia shook her head. "I do not know. Dad just said, 'They found her, and if I do not act first, my daughter will be next.'" Then he slammed his hand on the table. Grace sat still as the pieces slid into place. Nate was not simply a grieving husband or a father raising a child alone. He was investigating something, tracking the shadow of a threat surrounding Isabel's death, and he clearly did not believe the story everyone else repeated about a car accident. Grace tightened her hold on Sophia's hand. "Are you afraid?" Sophia looked up slowly and shook her head. "Not when I am with you." Grace smiled, though a storm had risen inside her. Nate knew far more than he showed. He was holding back something enormous. And if what Sophia heard was true, Isabel had not been killed by chance, but because she had been a threat or had carried a secret powerful enough to silence her forever. The confrontation. That night after Sophia fell asleep, Grace walked down the long corridor that led toward the main house. The lights on the lower floor were still burning, casting warm rectangles across the stone. She stayed hidden behind a row of pillars, able to see Nate standing alone near the fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, staring into the blaze. On the table beside him lay an open stack of documents, including what resembled satellite images and location schematics. He was not a man drowning in grief. He was preparing for something: revenge, revelation, or both. Grace could not guess, but she understood then that the storm around her was not the echo of a broken family. It was the visible tip of something vast and hidden, a force capable of pulling all of them into its depths. It was past 2 in the morning when Grace walked down the hallway to get water and noticed the library door was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting through the darkness. She hesitated, then pushed the door open, gently, intending only to check if everything was safe. Nathaniel was there, but he wasn't working. He was slumped in his high-backed leather chair, a half-empty glass of whiskey near his hand, his breathing deep and rhythmic. He had fallen asleep, succumbing to the exhaustion he hid so well during the day. The fortress had a flaw. Grace realized that it wasn't the walls or the cameras. It was the man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Grace stepped closer to drape a blanket over him, but her movement froze. The mahogany desk was scattered with maps and documents covered in complex ciphers and timelines. Nate wasn't just reading, he was decoding. Most of the files were stamped, classified, or obscured by black marker. But in his exhaustion, he had let one sheet slip out from under a heavy whiskey tumbler. It wasn't a name that caught her eye first, it was a face. Half hidden beneath the glass was a grainy surveillance photo of a man she had hated for 5 years. And next to it, circled in aggressive red ink, was the location: Queen's Sector 4. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out. It wasn't locked away. It was right there staring at her from the abyss of the past. She did not have time to read everything, so she skimmed quickly for what mattered. A heading leapt out at her. Castellanos Internal Network, Suspected Connections to Vega Case. Beneath it was a list of names. Many of them crossed out in red, but two names nearly made her drop the file. Hector Jimenez and Luis Arana. Those were the men who had been aggressively hunted by police after the Bronx shooting, the same shooting that killed Liam. She remembered their photos, taped to her apartment wall, the desperate questions she had asked in anonymous forums. And now, their names sat in Nate's private dossier. The next page showed a network diagram with arrows linking the Castellanos cartel minor political figures and several police officers once suspected of taking bribes. At the center of it all was a photo of Isabel Moretti, real name, Isabel Vega, circled in red. The notes underneath made Grace's blood run cold. Primary witness Bronx shooting case 2019. Subject fled protective custody with infant daughter aged 12 months. Status missing. Grace's lungs seemed to stop. The math was perfect. The tragedy was identical. 5 years ago, a woman named Isabel witnessed Liam's death while holding a baby. A baby who was now the 6-year-old girl drawing castles in the garden. Nate was tracking everything. He was not simply grieving, he was hunting the people who had manipulated and murdered his wife. And he might be doing it alone or with a very small circle. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced further down the page and froze. Hector Jimenez, the man who killed Liam. Her hand trembled as she reached out her fingers, brushing against the rough paper of the file. She had to know. Her hand trembled as she reached out to slide the paper free. But before her fingertips could graze the page, the air in the room shifted. In a blur of motion, the sleeping man vanished. A hand clamped around Grace's wrist, like an iron manacle, twisting her arm back with terrifying speed. Grace let out a sharp cry as she was slammed against the edge of the bookshelf. Trapped. Nate was no longer asleep. He was standing over her, his breathing controlled, his eyes dark and empty of recognition. In his other hand, a letter opener was pressed dangerously close to her throat. For a heartbeat, he wasn't a father or a man of business. He was a weapon. Then his eyes cleared. He blinked, the cold steel in his gaze fracturing as he realized who he was holding. Grace. His voice was a rough growl, dropping the makeshift weapon, but not releasing her wrist. You have a death wish, walking in here like that. Grace did not flinch, though her heart felt ready to burst. She stood her ground in the dim light of the study, locking eyes with him. I saw the names, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Hector Jimenez and Luis Arana. Nate's eyes narrowed. You had no right to touch them. Liam, my little brother. Her voice wavered. They killed him. On an afternoon 6 years ago in the Bronx, he was only 13. The shooting was meant to settle a score, but my brother, he was just a kid buying ice cream. Nate moved toward her slowly, the hardness in his gaze beginning to fracture. I searched for them for 3 years, Grace whispered, but no one believed me. No cop cared. Everyone called it a community mishap. I could not let him fade into nothing, and when I saw Isabel wearing that necklace, I knew her death and Liam's were connected. Silence fell between them like a crack spreading across frozen water. Nate looked at her, the anger dissolving into something quieter, something bewildered and sorrowful. Do you have proof? Not much. Only small pieces, scattered traces. But when I saw your investigation, those names, that photo of Isabel, circled in red, I knew you were searching for the same thing I was. Nate turned away, his shoulders sinking under the weight of memory. After a long pause, he spoke, still facing the wall. Isabel did not die in an accident. She was once a witness in a human trafficking case. The government put her in witness protection under the name Isabel Vega. But then she vanished from the system. I think she was betrayed, and I think someone inside sold her information to the Castellanos people. Grace felt her hands trembling. Then Sofia. Nate nodded. Sofia knows nothing. I tried to keep her out of all of it. But they are circling back. They did not just want to silence Isabel. They wanted to make sure no one in her family survived long enough to speak. Grace stepped closer, her eyes fixed on his. Then let me help you. Nate shook his head. You have helped too much already. You nearly died for that child. I cannot let you go deeper. I do not have another choice. Do you think I can go back to waiting tables pretending nothing happened while the men who killed my brother walk free? If you walk away, I will continue alone. But if you want justice, I am here. Their eyes met, the space between them dissolving. Two souls carved by loss and injustice, recognizing each other in a moment that left no room for doubt. Nate nodded slowly. Not a promise, not forgiveness, but an unspoken pact between two people who had looked straight into the face of darkness. They did not just share an enemy. They shared a wound and now a purpose. The alliance. That night they sat across from each other in Nate's study, the lamp casting warm light over the files spread open before them. The distance was gone, the suspicion gone, leaving us only two people piecing together a truth neither wanted to see, but both understood they could no longer avoid. Nate lifted a photograph. Isabel, with soft curls and sorrowful eyes, standing in front of a small storefront. The corner of the picture torn, but her smile still intact. Isabel was not killed by chance. He murmured, his voice dry, as night wind brushing stone walls. She fought back. As Isabel Vega, she had been the only witness willing to expose a massive trafficking and laundering network tied to the Castellanos cartel. But after her first hearing, her file was leaked. Nate believed someone inside the system sold her out, forcing her to run with her 1-year-old daughter. They found her only 2 years later. The car accident was a cover. Her brakes had been tampered with and nearby cameras were shut down for 5 minutes before and after the crash. No investigation, no questions. I know they are still out there, Nate said, his eyes like blades. They thought killing her was the end, but they did not know I recorded a conversation between Isabel and one of their informants. He told her, "If you do not disappear, we will take the child." Grace shivered. "And now they are coming for Sophia." Nate nodded. "They do not know yet that I have evidence, but they will. And then the child becomes leverage again." Grace bowed her head, thinking of Sophia's brave little eyes and the drawing she had made with the words, "Best friends forever." She would not allow another child to live in fear as Liam had, as she had for years. "What do we do?" Nate pulled an electronic map from a drawer. The red points marked underground Castellanos sites in New Jersey and Queens that he had monitored for more than a year. He pointed out locations tied to laundering operations and one suspected archive used for blackmail files and target lists. "I need to get inside and retrieve the hard drives. Only that will force the government to reopen the case." Grace studied the map without hesitation. "I am going with you." Nate looked at her this time without protest. "You understand this could kill you." Grace exhaled a weary sigh. "I risked my life the day I stepped into Romano's and shielded Sophia." They spent the rest of the night planning. Nate would contact people he trusted. Grace would cross-reference the names and photos using the memory of the faces she had hunted for 5 years to identify the men the system had missed. They divided roles, calculated entry routes, escape points and timing. When the clock struck 3, marking the beginning of a new day, Grace leaned back. "Do we have a chance of winning?" Nate looked toward the dark window. "I do not know. But if we do nothing, they will return again and again, and next time they may not hesitate with Sophia." Grace stood approached him. "Then let us end it once and for all." Nate looked at her, and for the first time a smile flickered soft inevitable, like a wordless oath between two strangers who were no longer strangers at all. Neither of them was a hero, but both had lost too much to turn back. Now they stood on the same side, not for revenge, but to end the cycle. The storm began pouring after midnight, heavy drops falling as though the sky were emptying everything it had withheld for weeks. In the estate surveillance room, screens flickered with unusual motion near the woods behind the house. Elena leaned closer, her eyes fixed. "They are coming," she said, her voice flat. At the same moment, Nate entered from the hall. His shirt buttoned, his gun at his hip, his gaze cold as forged steel. He had expected this ever since the data revealed the cartel leader was relocating. Grace woke to the sharp, brief alarm that echoed through the estate. She ran from her room and found Sofia already in Elena's arms. "Downstairs," Elena instructed. "Panic room now." No explanations were needed. Grace held Sofia close as they rushed down a narrow corridor leading to the hidden chamber behind a bookshelf. The panic room resembled a miniature bunker, steel walls, independent ventilation screens showing exterior feeds and an internal communication line. The door sealed behind them just as the first shot exploded outside. Sofia trembled in Grace's arms, but her eyes remained brave, resolute enough to make Grace ache. "Are you all right?" Grace whispered. "I am not leaving you. I trust you," Sofia answered, gripping her shirt. Outside, the attack had begun. Black-clad intruders moved with military precision, surrounding the estate from 4 directions. But Nate had anticipated this. From the rooftops, his most loyal fighters, those who owed Isabel their lives, opened fire. Elena joined the battle the moment the steel door closed, rolling across the corridor and taking down the first intruder before he could raise his weapon. Rain slicked the guns and blurred the sightlines, but it also masked movement. Lightning flashed, illuminating faces, twisted in focus, guns spitting fire, blood pooling across stone. Nate moved like a quiet storm, shifting between positions, with the discipline of a man who had lived through more battles than he had ever described. He did not shout. He did not falter. He signaled and struck. An explosion rattled the garage as the enemy tried a secondary entry. Nate countered immediately. Bullets shattered glass. 2 attackers dropped. Inside the panic room, Grace watched the feeds helplessly, yet knew that her composure was everything to Sofia. Each time a shot rang out, she tightened her hold. Time stretched thin. Then the screen switched to a warning. The leader had been captured. Castellanos himself lay bound on the wet stone face, bloodied but alive. One of Nate's men stood over him, gun to his temple. Nate approached, eyes burning. "You thought you could end my family the way you ended Isabel?" Castellanos let out a guttural laugh, but fear had already hollowed out his stare. Nate did not shoot. Instead, he gestured. "Bring him to the secondary bunker. Prepare to hand him over. I want him long enough to talk." Elena contacted Grace. "It is over. He's captured. No more threats." The panic room door opened. Grace gathered Sofia in her arms and stepped into the cool, rain-washed air. The estate still stood tall, carrying the scent of gunfire and blood, but it remained the only place Sofia had left to call home. And now, after a night that felt carved from nightmare, Grace understood something with absolute clarity. They were no longer running, they had just survived the storm, the aftermath. The sun rose slowly after a night that had felt as if even the sky itself had grown weary from watching too much blood spill and too much fear take root. And in the pale morning light that followed the ambush, the Moretti estate no longer resembled a cold fortress, but a trench that had somehow endured the storm. Shattered windows had been covered with canvas. Bullet scars still pressed into the stone walls, yet inside the air had softened, quieted. Grace sat on a wooden chair in the reading room of the guest house, a bandage wrapped around her left arm where a bullet had grazed her during the chaos, the dull ache that pulsed each time she moved, reminding her that she was still breathing, still here, and that Sofia, the little girl only a few steps away, was still safe. The child sat on the rug with a nearly spent box of colored pencils, drawing with intense concentration until she finally held the page up with a mix of pride and shyness. "I made this for you," she said softly. Grace took the drawing and felt her throat tighten. Against a sky shaded with pale blue pencil stood a small stone castle with red roof tiles, not grand, not imposing, but warm with smoke curling from its chimney and glowing windows. On the grassy lawn in front were 3 tiny figures holding hands. A little girl, a woman with brown hair, and a tall man beside them. And beneath the scene in Sophia's uneven handwriting were the words, "Our real castle." Grace ran her fingertips over the page as tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had once believed she would never have anything resembling a home again. Not after all she had lost. Not after Liam's death. Not after the years of drifting and surviving. Yet here in a child's fragile drawing, she saw a future she had never dared to imagine. Nate appeared in the doorway, his expression softening at the sight of them. And after a moment, he stepped inside and sat across from her. "The doctor says the wound will heal quickly if you rest properly." He murmured, his voice lower and gentler than she had ever heard it. Grace gave him a tired smile. "I have survived worse." They sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of Sophia adding more details to her castle. "You can leave," Nate finally said, the hesitation in his voice unmistakable. "I will cover all medical bills, travel expenses. You have done more than anyone could ever ask." He stopped as if the next words caught somewhere between his chest and his voice. "But I hope you will stay." Grace lifted her eyes to him, and in his gaze, she no longer saw the cold man she had met on that first day, but a father, and a bruised man who carried gratitude like a shadow he did not know how to name. "Sophia needs you," he added quietly, "and I think I do too." Grace lowered her head, tracing the edge of the drawing with her fingertip. She did not answer right away. Part of her still trembled, still held back, knowing this place was not a simple dream. It came with shadows, secrets, and danger. And yet it was here she had found her first flicker of light after years of darkness. "I do not know how long I will stay," she whispered, "but I am not ready to leave." Nate nodded a promise that needed no further words. Sophia dashed over and wrapped her arms around Grace's leg, the drawing still clutched in her hand. "It looks like a real castle, doesn't it?" Grace embraced her, smiling. "Yes, sweet princess, but a real castle is not the kind with tall towers or moats. It is wherever you feel you belong." And for the first time in a very long time, Grace felt she was no longer merely surviving. She was living. 1 year later. 1 year later, on a gentle autumn morning in Brooklyn, the scent of waffles and freshly roasted coffee drifted from the large windows of a small cafe tucked quietly at a street corner. The wooden sign above the entrance bore a chalk-written name, Liam's Kitchen. Inside, Grace Monroe wiped down the counter with a checkered cloth, her hair tied back, a beige apron, printed with a tiny cupcake around her waist. The cafe's name was a tribute. Liam was the little brother lost too soon on a violent night that had shattered the world she knew. And now, instead of letting his memory remain only as grief, she had turned it into purpose, into a place where life and warmth could begin again. The bell above the door chimed and Sophia rushed in with a kitten-shaped backpack and cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "Miss Grace," she called brightly. Grace turned, her smile warming the morning like sunlight through the window. "Hello, my princess. What shall we bake today?" "Star cookies, and maybe with rainbow sprinkles too." Of course. She gathered the child into a familiar weekend embrace, just as Nate stepped through the door, behind her dressed in a dark wool coat and a soft grey scarf. He nodded to Grace, his eyes quiet and warm. There were no declarations between them, no confession carved into the air. Yet every shared look, every Saturday morning spent drinking coffee while watching Sophia knead dough was its own quiet vow. In the small kitchen behind the cafe, Grace showed Sophia how to press cookie cutters and sprinkle sugar evenly, and she no longer resembled the exhausted woman who had once lived in a damp queen's apartment. She was a cafe owner, a mentor, a woman who had found enough steadiness within herself to teach a once frightened little girl how to laugh again. On the walls were framed photographs, Liam grinning beside a crooked birthday cake from childhood, Sophia in her school uniform holding Mr. Hobbs, Nate standing beside Grace behind the bar on opening day. Under each frame was a tiny caption written by Sophia in colorful marker, "A real family is wherever you feel safe." "This place is our castle." Liam lives in every cake. By late afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Grace sat by the window sipping chamomile tea, while Sophia carefully wrote out the next day's menu in her rounded handwriting, the golden light catching her hair and turning the whole scene tender and full. Grace breathed a long, steady breath. She had not forgotten the past. The bullets, the nightmares, the grief still lingered like faint scars. But she had learned how to live beside them without letting them swallow her. She had built a small but solid world, one where love was not a luxury, but a daily presence, and within this slow rhythm of flour and brown sugar and soft laughter. Grace Monroe was no longer simply the woman who once threw herself in front of a child to shield her from gunfire. She was part of Sophia's life, the keeper of Liam's memory, and a woman who had learned how to transform sorrow into a home. Every Saturday morning, the bell above Liam's kitchen rang with a familiar chime, and Grace always knew exactly who had walked in, even before she looked up. Nate Moretti came without announcement, without needing an invitation. He always took the same table near the window, where the light fell just right across the newspaper in his hand. And he always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, no cream, but brewed by Grace herself. No one in the cafe questioned anything. No one asked who he was. Because here he was, simply part of the warm weekend ritual, the man who smiled quietly whenever Sophia came bursting out of the kitchen, holding up a cookie she and Grace had made together. There was no hurried romance between them, no kiss exchanged among trays of pastries, no grand declaration of love in the small kitchen. Their bond grew out of quieter things, the glance that lingered a moment too long, the softening of an expression when one of them was tired, or the simple way Nate always stayed until closing to help wipe down the last table without saying a word. Once while Grace was wiping the counter and Nate stood across from her, tapping his fingertips absently on the wooden surface, she lifted her eyes and caught his. She did not smile. Yet her gaze shimmered as though some inner truth had just settled into place. "I once thought you would leave," Nate said, his voice low, not regretful, but honest. Grace set the cloth aside and straightened. "I thought so too. I was afraid that if I stayed, the past would find me again, that I would lose something else. But then I realized this is not a place I came to hide. It is a place I chose to keep living." Nate nodded slowly, as though each word she spoke reached something inside him he rarely allowed to surface. "I have lost many things. Isabel, my trust, even myself for a long time. But with you, things feel like they are starting to heal." They needed no more words. That afternoon, they sat long after closing, when Sophia had gone home with the sitter and the cafe was silent, except for the soft clink of spoons. They spoke openly about the past, about the sleepless nights, haunted by echoes, about the mornings when they questioned whether the day was worth trying for. And then they laughed, because both of them were still here, side by side, choosing to try again. One spring morning, Grace found a small lavender plant placed at her door with a simple card that read, "For the one who stayed." She knew instantly who had left it. No signature was needed. The firm, careful handwriting gave him away. She brought the lavender inside and set it on the windowsill, its gentle scent drifting through the cafe like a reminder that sometimes love did not need dramatic gestures. It only needed to endure quietly, deeply enough to hold two people who had once been broken. That evening, when Grace finished cleaning, Nate was still there, leaning against the counter beneath the warm glow of the hanging lights, the sharpness of his features softened by the golden hue. "I once thought staying would be the hardest thing," she said as she arranged the cups. "But truly, the hardest part was believing I deserved peace." Nate stepped closer, not too close, but close enough that his presence wrapped around her like a shelter. "And do you believe it now?" Grace lifted her eyes to his. "I am learning to a little more every day." They stood there without touching. Yet between them was a promise woven out of silence, a vow shaped by two people who had been shattered and still chose to remain. They had found each other not because they were unbroken, but because their fractures had made space for understanding, for trust, and for a reason to stay. They needed no noise, no binding words, only each other. The photograph. The late afternoon light drifted through the windows of Liam's kitchen, washing the small cafe in a warm golden hue. As Grace stood quietly behind the counter, her gaze softened by the sight of Sophia seated at the table near the window, carefully coloring a picture she had not yet finished. The lines were still unsteady, the shapes imperfect, yet the drawing brimmed with life. A small house with a red roof, purple flowers blooming along the porch, and three figures standing hand in hand. On the wall, behind Sophia, hung a large framed photograph, carefully placed as if guarding the room itself. It captured three people: Liam in his living years, with that shy smile and those smart searching eyes; Isabel, gentle in her white dress, holding little Sophia when she was only 3. A photograph that stood as a reminder, a quiet bridge between what had been lost and what had endured. Grace looked at it and felt a swell of emotion she could not quite name. The old pain no longer cut sharply as it once had. It had been softened, tended to, by days filled with true living rather than mere survival. She walked closer and sat beside Sophia, asking softly, "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Sophia lifted her head, her bright eyes shimmering with happiness. "It's our home, Mom, Grace, Dad, Nate and me. This is our real castle." Grace smiled, resting her hand on Sophia's soft hair. It was not a castle, but it was a home, not perfect, but safe enough for old wounds to find the courage to heal. She glanced at the child beside her, at the man who visited the cafe every week without fail, and at the photograph behind them. All the pieces that had once drifted apart were slowly finding their way back to each other. Grace felt a quiet truth settle in her chest. This was not an ending. This was a beginning. And this time she was the one writing the story. A story of love that did not need to be dazzling to be real. A journey from loss to rediscovery. A life rebirthed through trust. And the simple daily choice to keep going. This story belonged not just to Grace, but to anyone who had ever tasted grief, who had ever felt alone, who had ever believed the past had taken everything. Yet sometimes in the darkest corners of life, something miraculous begins. A small light, a hand reaching out at the right moment, a place that feels like returning home. Grace Monroe had found hers, in a child's drawing of a castle, in a man's quiet presence, in the memory of a brother who would always be 13, and in the simple revolutionary act of choosing to stay.